Moving on to the next question, which is of course is the 8-mark question. Examine the likely impact of Thomas Cook's plan to reduce the airline emissions. Extract B, line 6, on the socially optimum position. Use an appropriate externalities diagram in your answer. So that looks like a really good question. Let's dissect this. So firstly, it's talking about an externalities diagram. In Edexcel, you learn two main ones, which is negative production and positive consumption. We're talking about emissions, so of course, airline emissions, that is of course going to be a negative externality. So let's start drawing this, but let's have a deeper read into the question and the extract. So the impact of Thomas Cook's plan to reduce the airline emission. So they're fighting against it, okay, and its impact on the socially optimum position. Let's have a quick read of extract B and see if it hints at anything else. So extract B looks quite short here. So Thomas Cook's environmental impact. Okay, so they have essentially have lots of shops. The environmental impact of the travel industry is significant. It counts for 8%. That looks like a good stat to use of all of global carbon emissions. So they're actively trying to reduce their airline emissions. So they're trying to use a more efficient and lower carbon fuel aircraft. And they were included in the world's top 10 most fuel efficient airlines. Okay, now yesterday actually, I recorded a video called How to Get an A-star going into year 13. It's probably a couple of months ago now from when you're watching this video, maybe a couple of years ago now from when you're watching this video. But one of the main things I was emphasizing in that video is now when you're going into year 13, what you want to do is not just be able to recall diagrams, but actually understanding the diagrams, understanding what the curves mean, being able to manipulate the curves. And this question is a prime example of why you need a depth of understanding about diagrams and not just being able to recall the simple curves, as this question is assessing you on your ability to manipulate this negative externalities diagram, not just knowing your negative externalities diagram. So let's get started with the diagram itself. So of course, negative externality diagram is cost/benefits on your y-axis, quantity on your x-axis. But why is this negative externalities? Again, since if you think about airlines, planes, why do they cause negative externalities? And the main thing is it's embedded in the theory. This is because the social cost, the marginal social cost to society is higher than the marginal private cost. And why is that? Since the private cost of running an airline is just a cost to the firm. For example, it's the cost of the pilot, it's the cost of charting the plane, it's the cost of the fuel. Whereas the cost to society of the airline is things like climate change, is things like of air pollution. So all these negative effects on society, and we say the negative effects on society are much larger than the cost to the airline firm itself. Therefore, that discrepancy is the external cost and what we call negative externalities. So let's show that on the diagram. So of course, we get started, wrong pattern. So we get started with our marginal private cost. So we say supply equals marginal private cost. Then we say demand equals marginal private benefit equals marginal social benefit. And then of course, since it's negative externalities, like we said, there's a discrepancy between private costs and social cost. So this is marginal social cost. And like I said, due to airlines causing negative externalities, that means that social cost is higher than marginal private cost. And remember, what is the difference between these two curves? And if your content knowledge is strong, you should be able to recall this. That is, of course, external costs. But now let's finish labeling this diagram up. And what do we need to finish labeling up? Of course, the welfare loss. How do we get the welfare loss? The thing I teach my students, it may not make much sense initially. You go from your market equilibrium, and your market equilibrium is, of course, where supply equals demand. And then you go up or down following the social curve. And in this scenario, the social curve is above, so we go from the market equilibrium up, and that would now give us our welfare loss. And that is a way to never get it wrong if you can understand what that means. So now this is our triangle of welfare loss, and let's just label the quantities. So what will this quantity represent? Of course, where the marginal social cost intersects the marginal social benefit. Therefore, this quantity here would be the socially efficient equilibrium. So I'm going to label this QSE, and then this point here, the market equilibrium, would be QE. But now, the question is telling us Thomas Cook's plan is to reduce the airline emissions. Now, if Thomas Cook are reducing the airline emissions, what does this mean? It means, essentially, very simply, there's less negative effects on society. For example, there's less climate change, there's less air pollution. How is that going to affect our diagram now? We said the difference in marginal private cost and marginal social cost is the external cost, the cost to society. And of course, if the airline emissions are reducing, it means the external cost is also reducing. So how would we show that on this diagram? Of course, that would therefore mean if the cost to society is essentially decreasing, the MSC curve would shift inwards or would shift towards the right. And that is pretty much the main thing that we need to show on this diagram. So all I'm going to do is shift the MSC curve slightly to the right, label it MSC1, and that is exactly how you would show Thomas Cook reducing the airline emissions on this diagram. And as long as you have a decent depth of understanding of this diagram, this is a golden and a really easy 8-mark question, since all it is pretty much assessing you on is knowing the difference between MSc and MPC is external cost, and just knowing how to shift your MSc curve. So how we're going to finish this off, I'm just going to finish this off by labelling up my new MSc1 curve with the new welfare loss, of course, the new reduced welfare loss, and the new points, so the socially efficient equilibrium quantity and the market equilibrium quantity. So as expected, as the external cost is reducing, so is the welfare loss triangle. So therefore, our new welfare loss triangle, I'm going to label this welfare loss 1, and of course, new socially efficient equilibrium, which should be at this point here. Again, now we're MSc1 equals MSB, and it would just be this point here. And yeah, that is quite simply how to do this diagram. So let's pick up the last few marks by adding the application and putting a bit of this into wording. So I just want to find a bit of application where they're talking about reducing their emissions. Yep, so they've actively, so that's a good one I can use, they've actively engaged in reducing their carbon emissions. Yeah, so any one of them. So they were lower carbon fuel, the top 10 most efficient fuel, top 10 world's most efficient fuel engines, so probably will use that. So all I'm going to say here, if they're planning to reduce airline emissions, if the engines are the top 10 most fuel efficient engines, it's going to of course mean, like I just told you guys, the cost to society, the marginal social cost is going to decrease. This decreases the discrepancy between MSc and MPC, which is the external cost. Thus, external cost decrease, and external cost decrease, this causes MSc to shift inwards, to shift towards the right, to a new curve, which is MSc1. And then, of course, you can talk about how the welfare loss decreases, the socially efficient equilibrium moves right as well. So that's pretty much everything I'll write there. So I've just added the how MSc shifts, how there's a small triangle welfare loss, and since the question, of course, was specifically referring to the socially optimum point, I've added a reference there. The thing is, I have actually only got one bit of application here. This second part wouldn't actually be classed as application, I believe, since it is mentioned in the question. And if you remember back to the structure of 8-mark questions, 2 for each KA, so 2 knowledge, 2 application, 2 analysis. So I'm just going to grab one more point from the application to make sure I'm securing those 2 application marks. And now, of course, there are still 2 marks left for evaluation. I think a really easy way to evaluate this, classic way to evaluate an externality diagram. It depends on the degree to which Thomas Cook reduced their airline emissions, since we've just assumed they're pretty much going to shift the MSc to here. But in reality, they might literally just shift it to there, right next to the MSc, right next to the original MSc curve, thus meaning it kind of negates a lot of the positive effects we spoke about. It means the socially efficient equilibrium only slightly shifts, we only have a slight reduction in welfare loss, thus a lot of these positive effects we spoke about will be negated and will not be felt by society. And of course, even in the extract, and always try to use evaluation from the extract, is a lot more specific. It talks about how Thomas Cook has 560 high street agents. It provides not only flights, hotels and package holidays. All these will also contribute to carbon emissions. So you could talk about how they're only reducing carbon emissions on their planes, on their airlines, rather than holistically removing it. Like, for example, the high street agents or the hotels may be pumping out lots of carbon emissions as well. So you could talk about how they're negating one side and just focusing on one aspect, which is flight. But yeah, that's how I would answer this 8-mark question for 8 marks. And let's move on to the 10-mark question.